Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for an important conversation. I am Farrah Khimji, founder of Futura Funds, treasurer for NAIOP Greater Toronto, president for Toronto Crew, and your moderator for today's conversation. This conversation is brought to you through the collective efforts of 6 industry organizations in Toronto, namely BOMA, CoreNet, Crew, NAIOP, REALPAC, and ULI. These organizations collectively embody a significant representation of the corporate real estate industry in Canada. And we have recognized the need to come together and directly address the racism and the exclusion that exists in our industry. Hearing those words may be tough, but we have intentionally chose to use those words, as for many years now, we have been working to promote diversity and inclusion in our industry. And it is not until we can call out and specifically address the racism and exclusionary practices that exist that we can then truly move towards an industry that promotes and celebrates diversity through inclusion. We also recognize that it is not through one webinar or one conversation that we will be able to bring about change, but rather through continued discussion, engagement, and most importantly, action. This is why today is the first of a series of webinars that we will be hosting to continue the discussion, learn, understand our own biases, ask questions, and both individually and collectively work towards dismantling systemic racism in the workplace. In partnership with the platform of our 6 industry associations, this important series of conversations is brought to us by our lead series sponsor, KingSet Capital. And joining us today is John Love, the founder and CEO of KingSet, Canada's leading private equity real estate investment business, co-investing with institutional and ultra-high net worth clients seeking to provide premium risk-weighted returns through its various strategies. Founded in 2002, KingSet has raised $11 billion of equity for its growth, income, urban, and mortgage strategies, and owns interests in a $15 billion portfolio of assets. John was formerly president and CEO of Oxford Properties Group and serves on the board of directors of the Chief Executives Organization, is a member of the Business Council of Canada and YPO, and is a member of the Order of Canada. I would now like to invite John to the virtual podium to share the opening remarks for today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Farrah, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion. KingSet is proud to sponsor this series as we have recognized that as an industry, we have a role in the fight against systemic racism in our workplaces and our communities. As real estate professionals, our job is to build and to house people and communities which, to be successful, need to be inclusive communities. To succeed at that, it means we need to engage in discussions like we're having today, as we need to start with ourselves, our households, and our workplaces. I believe that diversity is one of Canada's greatest strengths, and that we need to do a better job to ensure that our strength, to ensure that the strength of this diversity is woven throughout our communities and our businesses. I believe greater diversity and inclusion will make our society and our business more successful. I also know there's a lack of racial diversity in corporate Canada and our industry, and while we have made progress over the years, we have a long way to go. As a leader in our industry, I'm committed to taking on this responsibility, not just at KingSet, but also strive to be an example for all of us to take a lead in making a difference in the way we move forward. In order to affect the systemic changes needed to foster inclusivity, we will need collective learning and unlearning, challenging ourselves to embrace innovative, equitable, and inclusive practices going forward. I also believe that it will take our industry as a whole coming together to share ideas and engage in discussions like we're having today to embrace and champion the changes we all seek. This is why KingSet is particularly supportive of today's event and continued series to discuss the important challenges that lie ahead. Thank you all. Thank you to all of our industry associations who have come together and invited us to be part of this initiative. We look forward to staying engaged and learning together. I will now pass it back to Farrah to kick off the discussion and introduce our keynote speaker, Karlyn.
Thank you, John, for those remarks. Personally, as a leader for Toronto Crew over the past several years, I have witnessed and understood KingSet's commitment to supporting gender equality in our industry. And it is great to have you on board leading the charge with respect to promoting racial equality as well. It will take leaders of all backgrounds coming together to champion the advancement of underprivileged and marginalized groups, even and especially if those are not the groups you identify with yourself. So thank you again to John and KingSet for your support. Now, before I introduce our keynote speaker for today, I would like to share my own experience and reasons for being involved in this conversation and for being committed to the championing and advancement of these conversations. Having been in the commercial real estate industry for over 10 years now, as both a woman and ethnic minority, I have experienced firsthand the challenges that has brought. I have walked into more than a few rooms being the only woman in the room and also being the only ethnic person in the room. And I know we like to think here in Canada that we don't have racism in our workplaces or that we don't face discrimination based on gender or ethnicity. I can tell you firsthand, this is my experience. As a senior leader in one of my previous roles, I was often mistaken for the receptionist and have been asked to hang coats, to make coffee, to mail out packages, to take minutes. And while I know how to do those tasks and often would just proceed to do those tasks, that was not my role. And it was most certainly not something that was asked of my white male counterparts. As an ethnic woman of Indian descent, I have also been categorized into many stereotypes. For example, the common amongst Asians, that we are all good at math or good with numbers. And while being good at math is not necessarily a negative stereotype, it is still a stereotype based on the color of my skin. I have noticed that we often try to address racism without addressing the differences that are experienced by different races, and specifically by Black, Indigenous people and women of color. I understand that my lived experience as an Indian woman has been vastly different than that of my Black colleagues, and that the labels I have been given, while still a label, are not the same as the negative and damaging labels given to Black people in our society. I know many people like to think that doesn't happen here in Canada, and that doesn't happen in the workplace. But saying that would be doing an injustice to the lived experience of those that live with those labels each and every day, both inside and outside of the workplace. And so today, we plan to call out and address that this lived experience is real, and that we all have a role and a responsibility in understanding the experience of our fellow colleagues in the industry, so that we can work towards dismantling systemic racism and begin building toward a more equitable and inclusive future. To help us do that, we have invited Karlyn Percil. It is with great honor and privilege that I personally have the opportunity to sit down and have this conversation with Karlyn, having been a follower of her for many years and being inspired by her work and commitment. Karlyn is a certified emotional intelligence and neuro-life coach with keen focus on diversity, inclusion, and belonging. She is also the CEO of KDPM Consulting Group, Inc., and the founder of SisterTalk Group Leadership and Wellness Academy, a mentorship group dedicated to amplifying the voices of Black, Indigenous, women of color, leveraging community and personal narratives and storytelling as a catalyst of success. Karlyn has dedicated her career to helping corporations plan, develop, and execute successful and comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership strategies to support inclusive organization and human optimization goals. Her motivation to improve the status quo stems from her passion as a Black leader and her former 20-plus-year career as a bank executive, where she experienced discrimination, racial and gendered biases, and emotional attacks. Karlyn is passionate about change and believes that inclusion is not just a trend, but a verb that requires action. Karlyn, thank you for joining us today. The format for today is that Karlyn and I will chat for the next 40 or so minutes, and we will leave the last 10 minutes for questions. So please send in the questions as they come to you throughout our session, and we'll be sure to address them at the end. So I would like to start off our discussion by learning more about your experiences working with the corporations that you have engaged with in the past and are engaged with now. And specifically, since the death of George Floyd, the conversations seem to have evolved and the narrative is beginning to change. And yet, many here in Canada still feel that we don't have the same problems as in the States. What is your response to that? And how do you feel that this moment is different than just a few months prior?
Thank you, Farrah, and thank you everyone for joining us again. I know last week we had a bit of a technical difficulty. It's a micro invalidation. I mean, what you just described is framed as a micro invalidation. When we deny the fact that there is systemic racism here in Canada, and we look to the US and say, well, at least we're not that bad. Again, this is an output, and it shows you how systemic racism has not only reaffirmed the racist or racial biases that exist as part of the interpersonal part of racism, but it also shows you how alive it is. Because if in 2020, we have a whole lot more access than when I think about, the 400 years, the 4 centuries, our ancestors have been speaking, marching, protesting, asking for policies to be taken down where, we can't get work or can't get paid, dying in the process. When you think about the transatlantic slave journey and the inhumane conditions of the boat and how our people were treated. And then you have some person telling you that, hey, systemic racism doesn't happen or it doesn't exist. I don't think I have the full words to describe what it feels in terms of invalidating all the work our ancestors have done and where people have died doing this work. It's painful, and it continues the dehumanization of the Black folk, right? The Black individual. And this is why right now in Canada, the systemic racism or structural racism or interpersonal racism is still so alive, because when you look at the dimensions of racism, racism is not just an individual or, an unconscious bias act, but racism is a system. And if we look at it as a system, then we would realize how much the system have hurt and dehumanized the lives of so many Black people for so many centuries.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And, my follow-up to that is, can we get into what systemic racism really is and how that shows up in the workplace? Because it's often overlooked. It's hard to spot, call out, and it's, sometimes covert. So could you please tell our example, what systemic racism is and provide examples of how it presents itself in the workplace?
I think you almost can't talk about racism without acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is that race is a social construct, right? Racism is made up. It's a system that was created, to keep to justify why Black individuals had to work for no pay, and also not just no pay, but in inhuman conditions for so many centuries. And if you look at the history of race and how it was socially constructed, then when slavery was constructed or formalized back in the day, structural racism was also formalized as well in the forms of, policies and practices and processes. So when you talk about systemic racism, you have to understand it in its entirety and not just as a a one-off, or you know, like you say, that somebody referenced racism once as the air that we breathe, or it's in the water, right? You're in it, so a lot of times you don't notice it. Like a lot of, you know, some people who are logged on right now, maybe you have the privilege of working in an organization or an institution, and you are part of that system. You're part of the, whether it's the hiring practices or the advancement practices, or in some cases, some of the high visibility projects. You are part of a system that might be embedded in systemic racism, right? Because and when you look at the definition again, the practices, the policies, the processes, the culture, the way of the shared values and the shared belief systems that are a part of this organization. Does it include the needs? Does it include the different experiences that racialized or Black people have been through? Does it include the marginalization and the examples of those marginalizations and how we experience it? And 99% of the time, the answer is no. So systemic racism, when I walk into a workplace, and I was part of that workplace for over 20 years, I'm walking into an unsafe environment. Black individuals, Indigenous individuals, we don't necessarily have that psychological safety, because the workplace is not set up to ensure that all lives actually matter. Because when you look at the individuals who are signing off on policies and practices and making sure that a lot of the processes that are a part of making the workplace organizational structure move forward, these are being made by individuals who don't fully understand all lived experience, or in most cases don't look like us. I often say, you know, people talk about, you know, school segregation being over, or even just segregation in general being over. But when you look at corporate Canada, school segregation grew up to have a bigger baby, right? And if you look at corporate Canada, then you see the adult version of segregation, because you see senior leadership, mostly all white folks, mostly white men. And if there are women, it's mostly white women, right? So it's ingrained, and a lot of people don't notice it. They're just like, oh, well, it's just a byproduct. But again, if you really have to think about equity or think about human equity, part of this is understanding and learning what is our history? What is the history of your organization? What is the white history, right? What is the white privilege history? Where are some of the places unconsciously systemic racism have not just been a part of your day-to-day, but because you're in it and you're living it, and it's a part of your everyday and it's part of your comfort zone, a lot of people don't realize that they're literally in the trenches and they're upholding, I call, you know, some individuals like gatekeepers, right? As a leader, your number one priority should be making sure that you're leading others equitably. If you have not paused to ask who's not in the room, whose voice is not being heard, and am I truly representing the public that I serve within my organization, then it means that you've just been complicit in keeping or upholding some of the systemic barriers. And one of the equity partners we work with, Matrix 360, Chandran Fernando, who's also a very good friend of mine, I think in 2016, they did a survey within your industry, specifically within the real estate commercial industry. And one of the findings in that Matrix 360 report was it really showed, you know, over 87% of senior leadership positions are, you know, given to white men, or in some cases that unbiased access. And that's what I want people to understand. When you think about the system, there's so many different parts to it, but that unbiased access to power, to privilege, to policy or decision-making seats at the table, this is not something that is given, or we don't have access to those opportunities. Some of us don't have access to those opportunities. So it's extremely important to look at racism, or to look at systemic racism as a system that is a part of every single part of your organization. And yes, part of that is the individuals, the leaders who are working as part of your organization. And this is where interpersonal racism or interpersonal racial bias can come in as part of the day-to-day process.
Thank you for that. I think that, you know, a lot of us here can acknowledge, I think that, yes, we do see there's a lack of representation in our leadership teams, that our industry specifically, while progress has been made, there's still a long way to go, and there isn't the representation we'd like to seek. But I also feel like a lot of people are saying, well, what can we do to change that? And so that leads me to my next question. You know, you've designed this framework called the LEAP framework, which really is to help individuals and corporations have more structured conversations and move from sort of learning to action. And so can you share with us why you developed this framework and walk us through, you know, all the 4 parts of the framework?
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about this particular movement that we're in right now, we went through a health pandemic with COVID. Now we're going through a racial pandemic, and you know, the research shows. I mean, finally, the Toronto Health Commission has declared anti-Black racism a public health crisis. The conversation has been going on for years, right? 400 years, you know, 4 centuries for Black folks, for Black individuals. We don't want to have the conversation. We need to get to action. But we also understand that there are a lot of people who don't even know their white history. There are a lot of people who don't know the anti-Black racism history or the anti-racism history. Let's be honest, there are a lot of people who probably saying the word anti-racism or anti-racist or any of those words for the very first time. So in order for us to not be emotionally hijacked, right? Because we are now stepping outside of our comfort zone. Those words are probably sending up, if I say the word white privilege or white superiority or white supremacy, there are probably images and different, you know, thoughts and emotions that might come up from ranging from shame, fear, helplessness, annoyance. You know, some of you might just want to just, you know, shut me down right now. All of these are natural. It's part of the human condition because we're wired to feel emotions. So I really wanted to get people to, hey, don't get sidetracked or distracted. We are at a really pivotal moment in history, and every single one of us have a role to play, right? So how can we move forward with intention? How can we move forward with not just intention, with impact? So LEAP was the framework I designed to help people to move through this with clarity, with curiosity, but also with compassion, because there is a lot of unlearning and unpacking that needs to be done. And L stands for listen, learn, so that you can unlearn some of the internal, as the individual, if we're looking at it from an individual perspective, so that you can understand some of the unconscious racial bias or the covert or overt racist acts that might have been a part of your, whether it's on your vocabulary in terms of language, or maybe you have been perpetuating as a leader within your organization, not realizing that exclusion has been happening as part of the processes and systems that you inherited as a leader in your organization. So L is all about really starting that journey and centering, and what, Farrah, a huge part of dismantling systemic racism is understanding who have been marginalized because of those systemic racist policies and practices and procedures. So which means the listening is really around centering Black experiences, centering Black lives. I don't speak for all Black people. I think about all the trans people who are going through either dying right now, but no one's saying their name or put in a spotlight. We have different Black folks with different intersecting identities whose voices are not being heard, but they are being served by communities who don't understand their needs, but saying, here's what we think works, which in itself is a microaggression. So this is the first part: centering, listening, learning, staying with the discomfort, understand what we have been going through for the past 400 years. And then we go to E. E is about embracing and examining your own white SPF, right? And if you don't identify as white, it can be whether you're whatever identity you identify with. Understand your history. Did your family own slaves? If you're looking at it from a personal perspective, what is my own white history? Where in my family may I have been perpetuating, anti-Black racism behavior or language or jokes? Because a lot of things that we do, we don't even think about it. That's where bias comes in, right? We just automatically speak or we automatically share because it's what we did all along. But now we have the opportunity for us to examine those biases, examine those truths. Look at our different social systems. Look at the education system. We've left out Black history for so long, which actually fuels the Eurocentric superiority complex. And what the research shows us is that when you look at words as brilliant, capable, smart, what comes in mind in terms of the image is a white person, right? Very Eurocentric features, et cetera, et cetera. And that is perpetuated in every other system. Think about our social system in terms of social media and news. Think about our education system. I've asked, I've taken a poll, how many of you learned about Black history in school? A lot of people don't know. How many people know about the role Canada played in terms of the trans-slave, slavery Atlantic, movement, but also looking at, the Underground Railroad, or even just looking at our own, who was the first free person who came to Canada, which was Matthew DeCoster. Like, a lot of individuals don't even know our own Canadian history. So how are you creating systems or policies or procedures or designing programs to serve the general populace when you don't fully know what their needs are? That is literally the output of systemic racism. So when you examine, your history, your systems, your procedures, looking at your circle, who's at the table, who's not, then you can now take that information. And when we go to A, which A stands for act, and act stands for activity that causes transformation, right? We have enough information out there. We're intelligent beings. We don't need to sit here and discuss whether or not we have systemic racism. The conversations need to shift to, what can we do about it today? How can we truly make Black Lives Matter wherever you are in your industry, in your workplace, in your community? Are you on a school board? Are you sitting on a health board? Do you have the privilege period of being on a board? And if every single person on the board, they look like you, they're white, we went to the same school, you're literally as a part of groupthink. Right? So how can you disrupt that? How can you invite more voices that don't look like you to the table? And how can you go about looking at the processes and systems in terms of, how did all of us get here? Did we have unbiased access? Because again, if you look at the definition of white privilege, is that where policies and procedures and practices are benefiting one group within the socio-political and economic, society that we're all a part of, but not everyone have the same access to those opportunities. So these are some of the ways that we can take activity that causes transformation. And then that is your permission slip to ask, right? I say, and that is my own personal opinion. Absolutely, you can ask, anyone how they can help or how you can help. But for me, you have to do part of the work. Because if you're coming to me and asking me about, oh, does racism exist? Then it means you're not ready for us to have that conversation, right? Because a simple Google, YouTube, you go to Google, you will be able to educate and update your own history or understanding how racism has been, alive in Canada. So ask, and I often draw people to the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit because of the extensive work they've done with the Black community here in Toronto. The Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit is the first of its kind, never done before. So we are also making history by simply having this unit under the leadership of, Anthony Morgan and former leader who started it, Anania Aludeli Grant. They're doing incredible work over the last 4 years, I would say 4 to 6 years, even longer, brought together different community groups, different individuals from all different parts, all different industries, to talk about what are the needs of the Black community. And there is a Toronto action plan that identified the various sectors, whether it's school, youth development, leadership, advancing Black leadership, and so forth. And in this action plan, there are over, I can't remember how many off the top of my head, but there are quite a number of action plans that if you truly want to make a difference, that you can now take or advocate for. You don't need permission because it's the voice of the Black community and you're not doing something out of your own bias, but this is coming from us. So I often say, go towards the groups who are doing the work, who have the community pulse, who have the Black voices pulse, and start there. And P stands for, how do you position equity every single day? Right? How do we get to a place where it's a learned behavior and it's a part of our action? How do we become equitable human beings? And I'm pretty sure, you've heard me say this before, but I often revert back to the quote by Austin Shannon Brown, who is a racial justice teacher and author from the US. And she said, she did a podcast interview with one of my mentors, Dr. Brené Brown. And she talked about, why is everybody getting so, anti-racism work? And there's a lot of white fragility and other fragilities in the sense of, not having the emotional resilience to really manage the work and to deal with the emotions that comes up. And she said that the work of anti-racism is really all about becoming a better human so that you can be a better human to all humans. And I'm like, this is probably the simplest and most, you know, the most powerful statement that I have heard around the work of anti-racism. And if you think about, you know, how do we position equity and how do we get folks who have more privilege? And when I talk about white privilege, I'm talking about, it doesn't mean that white people have not struggled or suffered. We're talking about white skin privilege and the unbiased access and opportunities that you have been given because of your, you know, your skin privilege, and the fact that the default culture is literally going towards the majority group, regardless of what organization you're in. It's really given individuals an opportunity to really understand what does it mean to meet every single individual at the human equity level. And human equity is a term coined by Trevor Wilson. He is the author of this book called The Human Equity Advantage. I call him the father in the in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. He's done so much work in this space. And when you look at human equity means that I am not going to treat all Black folks the same. Human equity means that I'm going to meet Karlyn where she is. I'm going to meet a Black trans leader where he or she, they are. I'm going to meet each individual at their level. So it's extremely important to understand how do we position or prioritize equity by leveraging the white power privilege, white position privilege, and white pay privilege, and start there. And you will mess up because you're learning and you're growing and you're unlearning as well in the process. The science of human behavior tells us that as humans, we have the capacity to do all of those things all at once, right? So it's a matter of, so the LEAP framework was created to help take people on a journey so they know where to start. So they know that, you know, you don't have to do all of it at once because it's a marathon. We're talking about, you know, and I'm happy that you mentioned that, you know, Farrah and John, that it's not a one-time thing, you know, like this discussion is not going to eradicate, you know, anti-Black racism or anti-racism from, you know, the real estate industry or for any industry, but it is the beginning. It's the beginning of the conversation, because this is how we create change. When you listen and you center Black voices and Black experiences, then you can better understand how you can prioritize equity. Where should you start? But most importantly, how can you leap to inclusive and actionable, an actionable plan that can really help shift and help us to get rid of systemic racism from our society. Because if one group is struggling, then all groups are struggling. Racism affects us all.
Thank you for walking us through that. I know I've been engaging with, you know, some of the material that you've put out about the LEAP framework, and we'll be able to provide to the audience as well the, you know, resources to come on how to contact you and your group and learn more about that framework as we continue on our journeys with this. But one of the parts that I wanted to kind of hone in on, you mentioned it quite a few times, and is this concept of privilege, because it's now come up in a few instances in my world, for me at least, that, you know, the word isn't often received favorably. I know myself, I used the term white privilege with a friend, and it was sort of met with a lot of backlash and an assumption that I was using it to imply the word racist. You know, and in trying to understand and discuss that with this friend, it also made me stop and say, no, that's not what I was trying to say. I myself have my own, let's call it brown privilege. So can you kind of just break down for our audience here a little bit more on what is really meant by the terms privilege, supremacy, and even fragility? Because I think they're nuanced, and I think that people have different interpretations, and for some people it's even the first, you know, time that they're hearing the concept white privilege, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And that's why I tell people the 3 C's to employ as you do this work: curiosity, compassion, and courage. Curiosity to really understand your emotional data when you feel that fragility coming up, and fragility meaning that immediately you want to protect. You want to protect yourself, you want to protect your identity. So you deflect and you defend. And there is really no acceptance or ability to see or to really hear what the person is saying. Again, this is a part of the human condition, right? The brain is designed to protect us and to keep us safe. So if there is a word or a phrase or, you know, an assumption that threatens one's identity, the social identity, immediately the brain will create that barrier to make sure that you're safe. But staying there is not good enough, right? We saw the lack of action from those who are not oppressed has led us to where we are today. This is why we have a global racial pandemic in the middle of a health pandemic, right? It kind of like blows your mind when you think about it. That shows you how important it is and why this moment in history is so pivotal. So with white privilege, again, like I said earlier, we're not saying that white people have not struggled or suffered. And if you reference the work of Peggy McIntosh, I think she has the most viral explanation or definition of white privilege, and calling it the invisible knapsack. And she has an essay on this, and she talks about your invisible knapsack. You don't realize the privilege, the access, the unbiased access that you have, because you walk into a workplace. When you think of it from a career aspirations perspective, you'll see yourself represented. So because either the CEO is white, or there will be several examples of white individuals in that senior leadership structure. When you think about, you know, what happened with not just George Floyd, or with so many of the different individuals who have died, with Regis right here in Canada. Can you interact with the police and never fear for your life? Can you interact with the police and know you're guaranteed to go home? Or most importantly, just recently, I saw Brandon from CP24 posted an article on, or it was actually a quote on Twitter, where some young Black boys were playing in the neighborhood, and the cops were called, and they gave them fines because they were playing too loud. And the very same neighborhood, some white kids were playing basketball. They were just given a warning, and they were told, you know, just don't be too loud. So again, when we talk about white privilege, it's there every day. The thing is that you don't always hear Black people talking about it on the other side. I mean, now there's more conversations, and now we're having deeper and braver conversations around it, but it shows up every single day, because white people are affirmed, they're seen, they're heard, they can see themselves represented. The default culture in terms of the majority group is geared towards them, because if you look at, again, our history, how history has been taught, and how Black individuals, our brilliance, our work has been excluded from history. And the stories that are told are the stories of slavery, and us, you know, working hard, and the dehumanization. If you look at the stats, I can't remember who posted it, but someone posted how many times the George Floyd video has been circulated. And you're talking about, you're recirculating the re-traumatization of Black individuals. Because I couldn't watch the video. I haven't watched it. A lot of my friends have not watched it. We can't watch it, because just by hearing and seeing it, the pain, I can't explain to you what that pain felt for his own family, his immediate family, and his daughter, who now doesn't have a father, even Regis and her family, who's now mourning her loss. So white privilege is really about understanding that invisible knapsack, and all the opportunities, even something as simple as jogging, going into the store, not being followed. And what the research shows is that education, or no matter how well dressed a Black person is, they do not have the privilege of not being followed, still being fearful when they're interacting with a cop. We have to fight for race-based data because of the impact of COVID on our health. Everything is a fight. So when you take, and actually, if for people to better understand what does white privilege look like, Jane Elliott has this checklist online that gives a bunch of different examples. And this is how, on the interpersonal side, on the individual side, in terms of looking at how can we treat each other on the human equity level, right? You have to be an equitable leader. You have to be an equitable human being, because you first have to understand how systemic racism has contributed towards your shared values and beliefs around racism, around anti-Black racism, because in some cases you may not even be aware of it, right? And I think a lot of us saw what happened with the Karen in the park, where she picked up the phone, knowing that, you know, when it comes to interaction between cops and Black men, he will. It will not end well for him. But what does that look like in the workplace? You look at the gatekeepers, whether it's individuals in HR or people who are responsible for people policy and culture of the organization. If you are a leader in this space and you are a white leader in this space and your entire team is white, how inclusive are you really being? You're designing policies and practices for an entire organization who's not at the table. So I invite individuals to feel the fragility around, oh, Karlyn said white privilege, or Karlyn said I have white. I don't think I have white. That's okay. Start there. Start there to begin your leap journey, because the emotions that are coming up, it means you're human, they're valid. But I challenge everyone on the call today, don't stop at your discomfort, because stopping at your discomfort is a definition of white complicity. It means that you're still upholding the systemic barriers that are in place. And if you are upholding the barriers, it means both of your hands are like this. So you can't do anything else. You're not dismantling. So I would say choose the right side of history. Put your hands down from upholding and start dismantling. Start looking around, what is in your family and the social groups you're part of. If you're part of a board, like I said, your local community, or you're part of the teachers board, PTA group. Are you on a health board? Or maybe you have proximity. When I talk about leveraging your white position privilege, do you have proximity to individuals who are on the police board or who work in the police? Like, as you're learning, educate them, challenge them. Start with, hey, who's not in the room, whose voices are not being heard, and start there. Because when we do that, we can begin dismantling, because the thoughts and the practices and the policies that are not coming out is not coming from a homogeneous group, but it's coming from different voices of different experiences and different intersecting identities, which is a better representation of the communities and the diversity of Canada. But most importantly, there is a better chance of ensuring that the practices that organizations are putting out, they are not furthering oppressing and re-traumatizing Black lives.
Thank you for that. I can see that there's a ton of audience questions coming in already. So I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to jump into the audience Q&A for a bit. But this is a question I wanted to ask, because it's a personal question, actually. So, you know, I wanted to address the concept of sort of microaggressions, what they are, how they show up in the workplace, and what we can all do to stop ourselves from perpetuating them. And I'd like to ask it in the context of an experience I had personally. A few years back, you know, I was out for drinks at a bar at King and Bay with coworkers, and one of the senior leaders I was with made a comment to suggest there was not a lot of Black people at that bar. And I was a little confused as to why he was even bringing this up, and suggested to him that, you know, the bar had drawn a pretty diverse crowd with other ethnicities represented, including Asian people. And this leader went on to say, yes, that is because Asian people have been accepted in financial district and Black people have not. Right? It's even hard for me to say this right now, but I was really thrown off by the comment. And in that moment, I just did not know how to respond. I wanted to address the comment, indicate that it was not appropriate to make the comment. I felt that it was racist, and I wanted to stop it in its track and also educate, all in the same moment. But given we were in a social setting and this was a senior leader, I didn't feel it was my place to reprimand. And I also feared, you know, the consequences if I did so. And so while this is a personal example, I know that others can also relate to being in the same position. So what do you suggest I and the audience can do to address these comments and behaviors when we come across it in the future?
Yeah, and microaggression, when you look at the definition of discrimination, it's a decision and an action, right, that further marginalizes the oppressed. And it comes through language and, like I said, action through what people do. So microaggression, they're racial slurs, they're usually targeted against marginalized groups. And for a lot of individuals, it's very, covert, meaning that they're part of a socially acceptable language and banter, or the things that we just say. So for a lot of us, we've never really stopped and paused to think about the impact on the individuals, like racialized people, like Black individuals on the receiving end. And because of lack of psychological safety, it's not that it hasn't been happening, it's been happening for years. But again, when you look at the power of language, or the power of really centering Black experiences and giving space for us to be heard, then I think we probably would have been much further ahead when it comes to recognizing and dealing with microaggression. So going back to my example, imagine you have, a chief people officer or a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer creating an inclusive workspace strategy to be more inclusive, but they're not even aware what microaggressions are. They don't know the definitions, they don't know examples of it within the workplace culture context. So it means that you're further oppressing and you're further marginalizing. So I would start, so I have two different responses. If you're on the receiving end as a Black individual, because of the lack of psychological safety in the workplace, and we usually don't have the support, because I remember being at work, and we often refer to microaggressions as tiny paper cuts, or Tracy, I did an interview on Cityline a few weeks ago, and Tracy called it, small mosquito bites that's all over your body, and at some point you're on fire, you just don't know what to do. And because we don't have language, and in some cases we don't have representation, we don't know who to talk to, or even how to reframe it. And if I do call HR, what am I saying? Because I'm not even sure what it is. And micro is because it's a one-on-one. So it usually happens between two different individuals. What I have learned from my own personal experience, and what the research shows, is that you need to prioritize, as a Black person, if you're a Black person, you're watching this, prioritize your psychological safety first. Meaning, check in, do I have the mental and emotional capacity to deal with this right now? And if the answer is no, because what people don't realize is that microaggression is not something we only face in the workplace. Research shows that over 40% of racist hurls and things that are hurled at us, it happens in the street, but it also happens in the workplace as well. So that might not be the first microaggression the person had been through. So really think about your own psychological safety first, and then if you have the capacity, check in and have the conversation with the individual. But also there are so many questions for us to ask, because when you look at white supremacy, it's power over, right? Equity is power with. So in some cases, there isn't enough safety for you to even address it, because just as you gave in your example, as a senior leader, what do? Will I compromise my job? Right? Will I be blacklisted at work? So there are so many different factors that go into it. So if you're a Black person and you're feeling a little bit of guilt, you haven't been dealing with it, it's okay. It's okay. I see you. I understand. And also, this is where allyship can play a huge role, because if a bystander have noticed a microaggression, this is where you can step in and check in with the individual and say, I noticed, X happened. Do you need my support? Is there anything I can do? You can check in, it's okay. And like I said earlier, you will mess up. You might say the wrong thing. That's okay. As we build equitable relationships with each other, as you listen and learn about all the various Black experiences, you will know how to interact. Somebody once said, I posted on a feed, on an article I posted on LinkedIn, and she said, what we have to understand is that the reason why there's so much white fragility is that a lot of white folks or individuals, the most interaction they've had with people are in the workplace, and that's it. And it's not it's a colleague. So it's not even a relationship. It's not a friendship, right? So there is that fear of talking, but I say start there, mess up, have the conversation. And if you are the aggressor, then there are some steps that you can take to start rebuilding the relationship and start rebuilding trust. The onus and the responsibility is on you. For you to start that process. You can role play with another individual, or maybe check in with another colleague or friend who might be able to guide you and give some insight. What is the best way? I don't know where to start. Like I said, not knowing where to start and being afraid or not having the right words is not good enough. Go out of your way, go out of your comfort zone, and get the help and get the support you need in order to start. And for what I want to say finally is that if you're on this earth and you have the opportunity to be on this live or watching the replay, it means that you have a responsibility to leave behind this world better than you found it. And 2020 has given us, I don't want to say, I'm not happy in terms of how the opportunity came about, because it meant more Black people had to die, right? For us to really start having this conversation. But do the right thing. As you think towards your 2030 self, right? We're kicking off another decade. What legacy do you want to leave behind for your kids? What do you want to tell them when it comes on being on the right side of history? And what do you want to share with them in terms of your own journey to living to accountable and action-based strategy when it comes to equity? What story do you want to tell them? I just want everyone to think about that as we wrap up with the questions.
Yeah, we are certainly in a moment of pause and reflection on what we want to build towards in the future. And do we want to build back to some of the things that weren't serving us? No, as we build, to whatever this new normal, I hate that term, but whatever it is, let's think about what we want to take into the future with us. And I think it's absolutely a valid point. So let's jump in here. We actually have a ton of questions, but the one that's been upvoted the most right now, I'll start with that one. I think we'll be able to get to two, hopefully. This question is, when Black women speak out, they are labeled as angry. This has caused many to shy away or fear voicing their concerns within their institutions and organizations. Yeah. How can you encourage them to speak up, and how can they be protected when they do from the possible backlash, overt or covert?
Oh, such a good question. Thank you for asking that. The first thing I would say is every emotion you feel as a Black woman is valid. Whether it's rage, whether it's anger, whatever it is outside of this, it's valid. Because the oppression that we've been through for so many years, there isn't anything else to do with it but just to let it all out. But the second thing that I would say is that the dehumanization of Black lives, Black women have also felt probably the greatest impact of it. Because Black women are policed from, I would say, the strand of our hair to the bottom of our toes in terms of our tone, how we dress, how we speak. And one of the things that we learned through our research through the SisterTalk Leadership and Wellness Academy, as you stated, we do a lot of work with BIWOC women. When the research on emotional attacks came out and we started talking about what does that look like in the workplace, one of the surprising, I shouldn't say it was surprising, but to hear it was around privilege of language. Right? There are certain words Black women cannot use. There are certain things we cannot say in the workplace for fear of being reprimanded. And that's why, for me, the number one thing I ask organizations to do as they begin the journey of doing this work, ensure that there is psychological safety for Black staff, especially Black women. And the second thing that I would say, I would, yes, encourage you to speak up, but make sure that you are okay first. Your first priority is to you, to make sure that you're good, and then speak up. The other thing that I would say is that I want white women to step up, right? I want white women to step up and be better allies, right? We know that there are lots of Karens, but also how can you be a better ally and a better advocate on behalf of Black women? And you don't need to have a current strategy or current example for you to do so. Just look at history. There are tons of different examples. We know that part of the Eurocentric superiority and inferiority complex, which is ingrained, right, from school, from education, which is reinforced through our media, through magazines, through the people we see as leaders, to the people we feature as leaders. We know that Eurocentric superiority, where the assignment of brilliant, smart, amazing, great is assigned to white individuals, but when it comes to Black women or to Black folks, then it's lazy, loud, I'm not very smart, etc., etc. This is where the unconscious racial bias comes in. So those complexes, those, I call them thinking systems, this is what fuels the unconscious racial bias. So we know that, right? It exists. So every single day, your job should be to advocate for a Black woman, You don't need to ask her. She doesn't need to ask you. She doesn't need to tell you. And same thing for white men as well, and for all other groups. And again, when you understand the definition of equity and what it means to create an equitable society, it's not a question of, well, what about me and what about you're centering the very definition of white supremacy and white superiority is that, again, you're centering your experiences, you're centering your life and your story, which, by the way, our entire schooling system, education system, health system, all of this has been centered around the white experience. So when you look at whiteness as a culture, it's important in order for Black women to speak up and to feel safe and to have the same psychological safety that's afforded to all others. It's important that we have better allyship in white women, white men, and those who hold most of the power in the organization.
Okay, thank you. We've got lots of questions. I'm hoping we can get to 2 more. So this one is, how can we uncover specific racist behaviors within our companies without placing the burden on Black and people of color colleagues to share their experiences?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. So what we have done is, in order for you to fully understand the lived experience of the Black and racialized individuals within your organization, if you are a company, you don't collect race-based data, which we know for majority of companies they don't, we created, as part of our LEAP program, we call them listening sessions, but we don't just do listening sessions where we throw everybody together. We do it with a psychologically safe lens, especially when it comes to looking at Black lives. So there's a checklist that we go through to ensure when we do listening sessions, we have a session of just only Black folks. And usually it's myself or somebody on my team who's also Black, and where we talk, no filters, no barriers, because you have to understand that we haven't had that luxury. I left the financial industry over 3 years ago, and it's only now more of my stories I'm sharing more. Because when I first left, I was like, everybody knew where I worked. I worked there for 20 years, right? So I can't imagine, because when I was working within the organization, I didn't feel psychologically, I didn't feel safe. So I didn't share a lot of things. I wrote it down, right? But I didn't share it because I didn't feel safe enough. And I felt like my job was threatened. So the first thing is to have that group and the same thing for other racialized group, depending on your demographics in terms of your numbers, and then have another session with your white individuals and other self-identifying factors. So that way you can create psychological safety for all, right? So then you can understand, what is that white individual's journey? Have they recognized their privilege and the unbiased access they've been given? Most likely not. And this is where you get to unpack and to see how now people can have awareness and consciousness around, I can see now how, systemic racism, or how I'm either perpetuating and upholding, or I now recognize an opportunity to dismantle. So you have to create the space where individuals can do that. You can bring everybody together, but my suggestion is to make sure that you're creating pockets of psychological safety where each group can speak freely, even white folks as well, so that you can get the true culture pulse of your organization.
Okay. We are getting close to the end, so I'm going to actually ask this because I think, it's very similar to the top question here, is that, myself and the audience joining us today really want to continue advancing our learning, our understanding, and engagement so that we can use our voice and platforms with intention, and more importantly, to act. So how do you suggest the members from our industry and our organization do? Is there, top 3 things we can, leave this conversation with today and start doing tomorrow?
So I would say, yes, start by leaping, start by bringing empathy to the table to Black lives and Black individuals. So have you had a conversation with your Black individuals in the workplace? Just a human conversation, right? That's why I love Trevor Wilson's quote on, the term human equity, because again, if you look at the term human equity, you'll meet people where they are. We have been impacted negatively and disproportionately throughout the racial and now the health pandemic, right? So there's a double trauma that we're going through. Have you fully seen and truly had that conversation? So I would say start there. The second thing is address the elephant in the race room. If you haven't done, anti-racism or anti-Black racism training, it means that a lot of your policies and procedures, your culture at the workplace is probably oppressing and harming Black lives and other marginalized groups, because you haven't truly listened to them or even understood what a microaggression can look like within your industry, right? So I would say to address the elephant in the race room, take a look at what have you been learning, training, listening to, reading. And the other thing is also begin a broader conversation with, just like how every single, it's so great to see this industry coming together on this platform and bringing the collective power of your voices, your power, your position, and your money privilege. What can you do collectively to change this industry? And this can be done on an individual, but also on a collective level, because systems don't dismantle themselves, people do. So we can talk and look at all the systemic barriers, but if you put someone who is anti-racist, right, or who's racist against Black individuals or other groups, they will perpetuate, they will not change the system, right? They will just continue with the status quo. So it's important that as we look at the structural, the institutional, the interpersonal as well, we look at the entire system to ensure that we're dismantling the system, but we're also including and hearing the voices of those who are not usually at the table.
Karlyn, thank you for this. You mentioned it today. We actually had over 500 registrants for the session, and guys, there's strength in numbers, and I really believe collectively we have the ability to influence the change that we wish to see in our industry and in our society. So thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. We will be having a continued series of webinars. Before we wrap, Karlyn, thank you for this discussion, and how can our members continue to engage with you?
Oh, well, you find me on Instagram or on LinkedIn as well, or you can also email through my website, KDPM Consulting Group as well. We have a couple of toolkits and different things coming out, but also if you go to my Instagram right now, we actually have a series on psychological safety and microaggression. So you can also follow that as well. I'm usually putting out content that's, relatable to what you can do and how you consistently take steps to move forward. So let's stay connected. And most importantly, I would love to see your personal commitment. Like, what is that one thing you can commit to based on today's conversation? Put it out there, text it to a friend, share it on social media, tag me. I would love to see what your biggest takeaway was, but also share this webinar with a friend when it comes out, and continue doing the work, because this moment in history, I think you want to be on the right side of history.
Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. Thank you, John, and everyone else.
There was a lot of questions we didn't get to. We are going to—
Can you save them? Save the questions. And so I would love to see the questions and probably send them over.
Yeah, we'll save the questions, we'll share them. There will be further series where hopefully we can get to everyone's questions, and we will send out, a thank you and kind of links to how you can get and follow, get in touch with Karlyn, but also follow her through social channels. So thank you again, everyone.